Good afternoon. Welcome to our annual webinar or our lecture. We were meant to celebrate Africa Day, which was celebrated yesterday. So I wish to welcome each and every one of you. My name is Dr. Njoki Wamai, and I am an assistant professor at the International Relations Department of the United States International University that is hosting this webinar for this important webinar, especially now in this COVID world. And the title of our webinar is Higher Education in a Post-COVID-19 World, the Challenges and Opportunities for African Universities. And we are very, very, very privileged to have our very own Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul Zeleza, who is an expert, as if many of you know, in the field of higher education, not just as a Vice Chancellor, but also as a scholar. And you know, he recently published another publication on higher education and COVID-19. So we are very, very excited, and I will not speak much because somebody else will introduce him much later. But I just want to welcome each one of you who is joining us from wherever you're joining us. We are very, very grateful. I have seen even the former chair of our council, Prof. Manu Chandaria, Karibu, and many other guests joining us around the world. Karibuni sana, as we say in Kenya. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our USIU poetry group that is going to present a poem that they had prepared for Africa Day. Yesterday, as I said, as much as we also are looking at the post-COVID-19 world in the field and politics of higher education, we're also celebrating, we're using this to celebrate Africa Day. And Africa Day is an important day, which was yesterday. And I also hear it's the Vice Chancellor's birthday yesterday. So happy belated birthday, Professor Zeleza. And so you share your birthday with a very important day, and I think we are very excited about that, and we celebrate you, we celebrate Africa Day. So I will now welcome our chair of department, Professor Cassandra Vini, who is going to welcome our Vice Chancellor, because he belongs to our department at the Department of International Relations, and also welcome the Dean. Professor Cassandra Vini is a professor in our department and also the chair of this department. She's also a published author in various fields like forced migration in East Africa, refugee state studies, and has written a book or books on diaspora studies. And so prior to joining USIU-Africa, Professor Vini taught at the University of Illinois in Chicago, in Illinois State University, and the Pennsylvania State University, and Loyola Marymount University, and also Quinnipiac University. So, and she's contributed a lot of publications on US-Africa relations, democracy and development in post-conflict African nations, forced migration in East Africa, a book she's written on structural adjustment and refugees, leisure in urban Africa, and women in African studies, among many other publications. So without further ado, I welcome our chair, Professor Vini.
Thank you very much for that welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend and participate in this very important and timely webinar. It is my privilege to have the opportunity to introduce the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Martin Jirogi. He is a professor of languages and social linguistics. He holds a PhD in linguistics from KU. He has a Master of Arts in Linguistics from KU. He has a Master of Arts in Leadership from PAC, you may say PAC University, and a Bachelor's of Education degree with honors from KU. And he's currently Professor and Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the United States International University, Africa. He is a former postdoctoral fellow and visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and also a former International Institute of Education in the United States. Professor Jerome is an accomplished scholar, educationist, researcher, and he's conducted extensive education, English language teaching, social linguistics, and African languages. He has led boards both here in Kenya and internationally. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Dean, and I will say once again that we're very honored to have our VC, who is a member of our faculty, to give his presentation. But first, Professor Njoroge.
Thank you very much, Professor Vinny, for that warm introduction. And I also join Professor Vinny and the moderator, Dr. Joki Wamai, in welcoming all of us to USIU, and especially to this webinar, which is being presented by our own Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul Zeleza. As you all know, in academia, we are mandated to teach, to research, and also to participate in community engagement. And this webinar creates a link between us and others so that we are able to have this conversation, this great conversation regarding the challenges and the opportunities that may be found despite the fact that we are living in unprecedented times. We are very, very, very grateful that our own Chancellor, Dr. Manu Chadaria, is also gracing the occasion. We are grateful that we have the Vice Chancellors from other universities gracing the occasion. And of course, we are very grateful to all of you for creating time to come and be with us during this webinar, which I believe is going to have very impactful conversations that will help us think on a way forward. And as the School of Humanities and Social Sciences are the ones hosting this conference or this webinar, we are very grateful to all of you for creating time to be with us. The School of Humanities and Social Sciences is the oldest in USIU-Africa, and we have various programs: psychology, we have international relations, we have criminal justice program, we have all languages of the UN, Chinese, we teach Spanish, we teach Arabic, we teach Swahili, we teach English, we teach Japanese. So it's a very vibrant and diverse school, and we have programs right from undergraduate up to PhD level, and we strive to achieve excellence in all that we do, in line with the vision of the university of being the premier institution of academic excellence with a global perspective. So today is not my day. Mine was just to welcome all of you, and also to welcome the DVC, Academic and Student Affairs, Professor Munyae Mulinge, to welcome the Vice Chancellor and introduce him, even as he takes the mic, to start the webinar. Professor Mulinge is a professor of sociology in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at USIU. and currently he's the acting DVC, Academic and Student Affairs at USIU-Africa. He's an accomplished scholar, researcher, and a leader and a senior administrator. So Prof. Mulinge, the floor is yours. Please go ahead and speak to us, even as you introduce our VC to speak to us. Thank you very much. Back to you, Prof. Mulinge.
Thank you very much, Dean, all invited guests. Mine is a very simple task, is to introduce our speaker for tonight. Like has already been mentioned, our speaker tonight is our very own Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul Tiambe Zeleza. Professor Zeleza has been at a dozen universities in 6 countries on 3 continents and the Caribbean region. He held distinguished academic and administrative positions in Canada and the United States for 25 years, serving in different capacities, including being a college principal, center director, department chair, college dean, academic vice president. This was before taking the position of vice chancellor or president and a professor of humanities and social sciences at the United States International University in January 2016. During the early 2000s, Professor Zeleza worked as a consultant for the Ford and MacArthur Foundations on their initiatives to revitalize higher education in Africa. His research project on the African academic diaspora conducted for the Carnegie Corporation of New York in 2011 to 2012 led to the establishment of the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program in 2013. And that program has to date sponsored nearly 500 African-born academics in the United States and Canada who work with dozens of universities in six African countries. He was president of the US African Studies Association during the period 2008 to 2009. Professor Zeleza has published more than 400 journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedia entries, reviews, short stories, and online essays, as well as authored or edited 27 books, several of which have won international awards. He has also published 5 short monographs. His most recent books include The Transformation of Global Higher Education, which was published in 2016 and covers the period 1945 to 2015. And then there is Africa and the Disruptions of the 21st Century, which was published this year. He has presented nearly 300 keynote addresses, papers, and public lectures at leading universities and international conferences in 32 countries, as well as served on the editorial boards of more than 24 journals and book series. Currently, he serves as editor-in-chief of the Oxford Biographies online in African Studies. Professor Zeleza has received numerous awards from various major universities for his scholarship. In 2013, July 2013, for example, he was recognized in the New York Times as one of 43 great immigrants in the United States. In May 2015, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws at Dalhousie University for outstanding personal achievement. In 2015, he was a fellow at Harvard University and has held the position of honorary professor at the University of Cape Town since 2006 and at the Nelson Mandela University since 2019. He has served in more than 24 international and national associations. Currently, he is a member of the Administrative Board of the International Association of Universities, the Advisory Board of the Alliance for African Partnership, Chair of the Advisory Council of the Carnegie Africa Diaspora Fellowship Program, Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Kenya Education Network, and a member of the University of Ghana Council. He has raised tens of millions of dollars in institutional funding and personal grants. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our speaker tonight, our very own Vice Chancellor, a renowned world scholar, a scholar of impact, Professor Paul Tiambe Zeleza. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Mulenge. Can somebody unmute my video? All right. Thank you very, very much to the organizers of this forum this afternoon, this morning, and this evening for some of you, and for that generous introduction. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the systemic deficiencies and inequalities in healthcare systems, economies, businesses, and education institutions around the world. African universities have been particularly affected. What does this portend for their future and for the production, consumption, and dissemination of scholarly knowledges? In this presentation, I argue that universities face various alternative and overlapping futures, ranging from restoration to evolution to transformation. These interlinked scenarios encompass every aspect of university affairs, from the modalities of teaching and learning, financial models, leadership skills, and institutional governance systems to modes of external engagements. In this context, it is critical to interrogate the desirable transformative trajectories for African universities. Constructing new futures for African universities and knowledge economies entails institutional, intellectual, ideological struggles and negotiations, and different ways of studying and assessing the value proposition of universities, not only for students and other internal stakeholders, but also for African societies and diasporas in their complex national and transnational dimensions, articulations, and intersections. As a historian, I trust you will appreciate if I begin by revisiting the agenda for African higher education set at the first African Higher Education Summit held in Dakar, Senegal in March 2015. The summit identified the challenges and opportunities for African universities in the realization of the African Union's Agenda 2063, which remains as pressing as ever. Indeed, it is even more imperative in the post-COVID world that will soon or later come. Secondly, I'll briefly review the challenges exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. Finally, I'll outline the agenda for reform and transformation in 4 key areas: digitalization, leadership, institutional cultures, and financing. Yesterday, as Dr. Njoki Wamai reminded us, was May 25, which is Africa Day. And also, as she noted, and thank you for the birthday wishes, it also happened to be my birthday. The African Union's Agenda 2063 provides, I quote, a blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. It is the continent's strategic framework that aims to deliver on its goal for inclusive and sustainable development, and is a concrete manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity and self-determination. End of quote. Education is indispensable for the realization of Agenda 2063, insofar as promoting integrated, inclusive, innovative, structural, and sustainable development requires building strong human capital, research systems, and robust identities and civic values. The Dakar Summit sought to, create a continental multi-stakeholders platform to identify strategies for transforming the African higher education sector, end of quote, in pursuit of Agenda 2063. I was commissioned to write the framing paper for the summit and help draft the declaration and action plan. In the paper, I provided a broad overview of the historical development of African higher education from ancient times to the colonial to the post-independence period. The latter, the post-independence period, is characterized by three trends: expansion, crisis, and reform. In 1959, before Africa's year of independence, 1960, because in that year, as we all know, 17 countries got their independence, there were only 76 universities across Africa, mostly concentrated in South Africa, Egypt, and parts of West Africa. The number rose to 170 in 1970, 294 universities in 1980, 446 in 1990, 784 in 2000, 1,431 in 2010, and by 2018, the continent had 1,682 universities. Enrollment rose from 0.74 million or 740,000 students in 1970 to 1.7 million in 1980, 2.8 million in 1990, 6.1 million in 2000, 11.4 million in 2010, and by 2017, the number of students in African universities was 14.7 million. As rapid as this growth was, Africa remained the lowest with the lowest levels of higher education institutions and tertiary enrollments, which stood at 8.9% of the world's 18,772 higher education institutions. Asia has 37%, followed by Europe with 21.9%, North America 20.4%, Latin America and the Caribbean 12%. And Africa has, by 2017, 6.6% of the world's 220.7 million students. 45% of the African students are in Northern Africa. To put it more graphically, Indonesia has nearly as many students in higher education institutions as the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, 7.98 million to 8.03 million. Enrollment ratios tell the story differently. In 2017, the world's average enrollment ratio was 37.88%, compared to 8.9% in sub-Saharan Africa and 33.7% in Northern Africa. Kenya's stood at 11.66% in 2016. For the high-income countries, it was 77.13%. For upper middle-income countries, it was 52.07%. For the middle-income countries, 35.59%, and for lower middle-income countries, 24.41%. The proverbial development case of South Korea is instructive. As pundits never tire of pointing out, in 1960, the country's levels of development was comparable to that of some African countries. Its enrollment ratio in 2017 was 93.78%. And China, the emerging colossus of the world economy, had a rate of 51.01%. Put simply, not enough Africans are going to university. The second trend I discussed in the framing paper was the massive crisis of structural adjustment in the lost decades of the 1980s and 1990s. The rationales and models that had undergirded them changed in the maelstrom of the world economic crisis and the rise of neoliberalism following the end of the long global post-war boom and the demise of the Keynesian welfare state in the global north and the developmentalist state in the global south. The impact on African higher education was devastating. It was expressed in declining state funding, falling instructional standards, declining facilities, shrinking wages, and low faculty morale. Academics increasingly resorted to consultancies, or they became part of the brain drain as they sought refuge in other sectors at home or universities abroad. And people like me were part of that trend. This was followed by the third trend from the 2000s, as many African economies resumed the growth of the early post-independence years, and democratization spread as struggles for the second independence intensified. The reform agenda raised and focused on 7 sets of issues that I cannot elaborate on because of time constraints. First, there was the need to re-examine the philosophical foundations and nationalist objectives of African higher education in an era of neoliberalism and knowledge economies. Second, African higher education institutions were confronted with the question of how to deal with their changing demographics and the demands for equity, diversity, and inclusion based on the inscriptions of gender, ethnicity, class, religion, etc. Third, the question of privatization and its effects rose to the top of the policy and public agenda as public institutions were increasingly privatized. Private institutions exploded and overtook public ones, at least in number, and for-profit institutions expanded. Fourth were the challenges of governance and accountability that became increasingly apparent. Fifth, financial pressures intensified as public funding declined, cost-sharing measures were developed, and conditions of work in terms of salaries declined, forcing faculty to indulge in income generation activities, including adjuncting. The result was low research productivity, poor staff morale, institutional conflicts, and declining quality of education. Many African universities became glorified high schools. Sixth, demands grew for accountability through the quality assurance movement from the ever-expanding stakeholders of higher education. Finally, the perennial struggle between indigenization and internationalization for Africa's higher education institutions and knowledge production systems entered a new phase as globalization accelerated. The paper noted some of the key global developments African universities had to grapple with. 4 stood out. First was the unbundling of the systems developed after World War II, including the erosion of universities' monopoly over research and credentialing, as new entrepreneurial providers and research institutions sponsored by business, non-government organizations, and other agencies emerged. Second was the disruptive and transformative impact of technology in all aspects of university activities, from teaching to research to operations and provision of services. Third, there were fundamental shifts taking place in the global political economy in terms of hegemonies and hierarchies, and in the nature and future of jobs that challenged traditional curricula and pedagogies. Fourth, new forms of intra and inter-institution competition and collaboration were emerging within and across countries, increasingly sanctified and reproduced by rankings that regulated global academic capitalism. I made 6 recommendations for the summit. First, how to match growth or massification with quality. Second, strategies for improving financing and management. Third, how to promote the articulation, harmonization, and quality assurance in Africa's higher education systems that needed greater horizontal and vertical differentiation and diversification. Fourth, modalities to promote institutional autonomy and improve governance. Fifth, enhancing research and innovation. Sixth, strengthening beneficial internationalization and diaspora mobilization. These recommendations found their way in the summit declaration and action plan, which identified 8 priorities. I'll quote each priority as described in the heading without, of course, elaboration. First, the first priority, we call for an ambitious commitment of various stakeholders to expand higher education. 2, promote diversification, differentiation, and harmonization of higher education systems at the national, institutional, and continental/regional levels by African countries to enable consolidation and assure the quality of educational provision against locally, regionally, and internationally agreed benchmarks of excellence. 3rd, priority, increased investment in higher education to facilitate development, promote stability, enhance access and equity, develop, recruit, and retain excellent academic staff, and pursue cutting-edge research and provision of high-quality teaching. Appropriate investments are required at institutional, national, regional, and international levels. 4th priority, African higher education institutions shall commit themselves to the pursuit of excellence in teaching and learning, research and scholarship, public service and provision of solutions to the development challenges and opportunities facing African peoples across the continent. Key actions are required by all stakeholders and levels to assure quality, relevance, and excellence. Priority 5, commit to building capacity in research, science, technology, and innovation. Priority 6, pursue national development through business, higher education, and graduate employability. Despite the rapid expansion of higher education enrollments, there are serious concerns about the ability of Africa's universities to produce the kinds of graduates who can drive the continent forward. Priority 7, nation building and democratic citizenship. As enshrined in the relevant sections of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, 1981, and in the AU's Agenda 2063, the continent seeks to deepen the culture of good governance, democratic values, gender equality, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. The final priority, mobilize the diaspora. Develop a 10-10 program that sponsors 1,000 scholars in the African diaspora across all disciplines every year for 10 years to African universities and colleges for collaboration in research, curriculum development, and graduate student teaching and mentoring. And this program, by the way, was building on the Carnegie African Diaspora Program. And 2 years ago, or last year, we registered the Consortium of African Diaspora Scholars Programs, and it's registered both in Nairobi and New York. Second, let me talk about the challenges exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. The outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in early 2020 forced universities, as we all know, around the world to confront unprecedented challenges that simultaneously exposed and exacerbated existing deficiencies and dysfunctions. 6 stand out. First, in terms of transitioning from face-to-face to remote teaching and learning using online platforms. Second, managing severely strained finances. Third, ensuring the physical and mental health of students, faculty, and staff. Fourth, reopening campuses as safely and as effectively as possible. Fifth, planning for a sustainable post-pandemic future. Sixth, contributing to the capacity of government and society in resolving the multiple dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Universities in Africa were among the most affected and least able to manage the multi-pronged crisis because of their pre-existing capacity challenges that centered on 10 dimensions, namely institutional supply, financial resources, human capital, research output, physical and technological infrastructures, leadership and governance, academic cultures, quality of graduates, patterns of internationalization, and global rankings. The first refers to the inadequate number of universities on the continent noted earlier. The second concerns inadequate financing, declining public investment, and limited philanthropic support for higher education. The third is about the insufficient availability of faculty and lessening attractiveness of academic careers because of the devaluation of academic labor. As an aside, 2 years ago, I asked students in my class that I teach in international relations, how many of them wanted to become professor? Not a single hand went up. And I asked them why. They started laughing and giggling and so on. And they said, professors are very poor people. The fourth points to low levels of research funding and productivity, in which Africa accounted for only 1.3% of global R&D research and development and 2.6% of scientific publications globally in 2014, compared to 39.5% for Asia. The fifth alludes to the poor state and maintenance of physical and technological infrastructures on African campuses, at least many of them. The sixth touches on external interference and politicization of university executive appointments, corporatization, and lack of leadership development opportunities. The seventh suggests growing social conflicts with the pluralization of internal and external constituencies and erosion of academic freedom. The eighth signifies persistent mismatches between graduates and the needs of the economy that results in high levels of unemployability. The ninth implies the durability of coloniality, intellectual dependency, and unequal international engagements. The 10th indicates the low standing of African universities in world rankings, notwithstanding the problems with rankings as instruments of global academic capitalism. Some of these institutional deficits directly affected the ability of universities to manage the pandemic and to plan for the post-pandemic future. Most crucial are the technological, financial, and research capacities, and the state of institutional cultures and leadership. Many African universities suffered from limited digital infrastructure, capacity, and connectivity, which made it difficult for them to transition online for education, research, and administration. The digital divide was evident among and within countries and institutions in terms of access to broadband, electronic gadgets, data costs, digital literacy, and preparedness for administrators, faculty, staff, and students. Digital inequalities reflected and reinforced the prevailing differentiations of class, gender, age, race, location, disability, and other social markers. The technological challenges were compounded by worsening financial strains. University revenues from auxiliary services plummeted following campus closures. Student enrollment and ability to pay tuition dropped sharply as economies went into recession and unemployment for parents or guardians rose. Government funding declined, and philanthropic donations fell and were increasingly diverted to emergency healthcare. Universities were forced to undertake severe budget cuts, including job furloughs, reductions in salaries and pensions, suspensions of capital projects, and renegotiation of service contracts. Some stared at the brink of bankruptcy and permanent closure. Under such circumstances, new investments in electronic infrastructures were difficult to support and sustain. The financial crisis was, of course, not confined to African or developing countries. It was a global phenomenon, as evident in numerous reports from UNESCO, the European University Association, International Association of Universities, on whose board I sit, and we have done a lot of studies of this, the impact of COVID globally, Association of Commonwealth Universities, and African Association of Universities. Depressing stories on the loss of millions of jobs in universities and other draconian cost containment measures, not to mention, were of course in these reports, not to mention in the academic and national media in developed and developing countries alike, such as to mention those newspapers and magazines that I read every day: University World News, Times Higher Education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and closer to home, of course, the Daily Nation and the Standard. Similar reports on the devastating impact of COVID-19 on universities have been produced by consultancy services such as McKinsey and Ernst & Young and Moody's. The pandemic not only put pressure on African university finances and operations, but also raised the stakes for research and policy interventions. The universities were expected to undertake biomedical and socio-economic research to manage the pandemic. As I noted in an article in University World News, summarizing a series of webinars by the Alliance for African Partnership that I moderated between April and July 2020, some universities produced hygiene products and personal protective equipment, including hand sanitizers, masks, ventilators, EpiTents for patient isolation, and mobile hospitals, testing kits, and robots for delivery of food and medicines to patients. Others undertook research on the epidemiology of the coronavirus and biomedical treatments and the socio-economic impacts of the pandemic, provided advisory services to government, developed software to monitor the pandemic's spread, and sought to raise awareness and provide psychosocial support to their constituents and the wider society. However, most African universities and firms stood on the sidelines as their societies waited for the development of vaccines in the global north, China, and India. At best, a few collaborated with overseas universities, research establishments, and networks, and hosted clinical trials, although they were caught unable to secure a fair pricing agreement, end of quote. And this is particularly true of South Africa. Weak research and drug manufacturing capabilities have made African countries vulnerable to vaccine nationalism in the global north, while democratic deficits have led to the securitization of mitigation measures, gravely undermining human rights in several countries. As of this morning, today, May 26, doses administered per 100 people range from more than 100 in 13 countries to 90% in the UK, 86% in the US, 56% in Canada, and 54% in Germany. African countries have the lowest rates of vaccination, ranging from less than 1 in 100 people in 18 countries, 1 in 100 in 7 countries, 2 per 100 in 8 countries, and 3 per 100 in 7 countries. This is a global, monumental scandal of deadly proportions. What are our universities, governments, and industries doing to serve and save themselves besides stretching their hands and praying for salvation from the rich world? And of course, instead of indulging in perennial and petty, but often vicious national and institutional politics. COVID-19 should be a wake-up call to African universities and countries to strengthen their research capacities, science, technology, and innovation systems, manufacturing capabilities, and interinstitutional and interdisciplinary collaboration through existing consortia, such as the African Research Universities Alliance and new ones. Beyond being involved in quality control and to have an important role to protect the continent from being used, quote, as a testing lab for COVID-19 vaccines, some believe African universities should join forces with the pharmaceutical industry and funding organizations to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines in the continent, end of quote. Funding for research by governments, the private sector, and the investors and collaborations among the three needs to be enhanced. Despite innovations made in some universities, the scale of collaboration with the industry that takes headline-making innovation beyond the walls of an institution is conspicuously missing. These collaborations can also provide an opportunity for further validation and a path to widespread adoption and commercialization. As I indicated earlier, the data on African research is quite concerning. I noted the publication data. Let me just give you a few other data points. In 2013, Africa accounted for only 2.4% of world researchers, compared to 42.8% for Asia, 31% for Europe, and 22% for the Americas. And I already noted, in terms of scientific publication, we only accounted for 2.6% in 2014. The World Scientific Report by UNESCO from which I got these figures, is publishing its latest report. It publishes one every 10 years next week. And I'm told by my colleagues at UNESCO that the African data on research has not improved that much. Now, if you look at publications, again, Asia is number one, 39.5%. Europe, number two, 39.3%, followed by the Americas, 32.9%, and so on. And I noted in terms of R&D, Africa only accounted for 1.3% of global R&D. Africa spends 0.5% on average on research and development compared to the world average of 1.7%, and 2.7% for North America, 1.8% for Europe, and 1.6% for Asia. No wonder Asia is leapfrogging leapfrogging very, very fast, and we are still where we are. Finally, the agenda for reform and transformation. A crisis, the saying goes, is the flip side of opportunity. The bigger the crisis, the more profound the lessons to be learned, and the greater the imperatives for transformation. African universities are likely to pursue three scenarios. The restore scenario will be focused on reclaiming the institution's pre-pandemic financial health, and a lot of university leaders are preoccupied in, can we recover from where we are, from where we were before COVID? The second scenario, the evolve scenario, applies to institutions that will choose to incorporate the impact and lessons of the pandemic into their culture and vision. And the third, which is the transform or transformation scenario, will be pursued by those institutions who will use the pandemic to launch or accelerate an institutional transformation agenda. All of us have a choice to make, whether we are going to spend our energies on the restore scenario, the evolve scenario, or the transformation scenario. For some universities, what is at stake is survival. And projections that have been done by some of the reports I was reading in different world regions, some universities will not survive. For others is stability, achieving stability. And for many, it is going to be the question of sustainability. You can survive, you can be stable in the short term, but how sustainable are you? Institutional survival is, of course, a precondition for stability, which is in turn essential for sustainability. Confronting the entire higher education sector is the question of its raison d'être, its value proposition in a digitalized world accelerated by COVID-19. I would like to focus on four critical dimensions: promoting progressive digital transformation, effective leadership, strong institutional cultures, and sustainable funding for African universities. For the first two, I propose a dozen strategies for each, and for the last two, 7 strategies for each, respectively. Given the limitations of time, I will only give broad outlines of the various proposed initiatives, many of which have written extensive papers. As a scholar of intellectual history, the history of ideas and knowledge-producing institutions, I'm only too aware that knowledge production is framed by certain crucial dynamics, what I call the 4 I's. First, intellectual, which refers to the prevailing paradigms. Second, ideological dynamics in terms of the dominant and competing ideologies at a given moment. Third, institutional dynamics as far as the nature and organization of an institution is concerned. And finally, individual dynamics, one's social biography with reference to gender, race, nationality, class, religion, politics, discipline, and so on. Institutional change occurs in the intersections of these dynamics. out of concrete social struggles within and outside the academy, among the university's ever-expanding and shifting constituencies or stakeholders. Change, in short, does not emanate from analytical prescriptions or rhetorical declarations, however compelling. However, constructing desired futures is not a wasteful exercise. It can inspire action, for ideas constitute an indispensable part of praxis. In a forthcoming co-authored paper with Paul Okanda, our Director of ICT at USIU, in the Journal of African Higher Education, the paper will be coming out shortly, whose abridged version appeared in University World News on February 11, 2021, and another version appeared in The Elephant, the Kenyan blog. A 12-point agenda is proposed for the digital transformation of African universities. First, they need to embed digital transformation in institutional culture, from strategic planning, organizational structures, to operational processes. Second, invest in digital infrastructure by rethinking capital expenditures that historically favored physical plant. Third, develop online design competencies, both individually and through consortia. What we've been doing in much of Africa, including USIU and the rest of the world, is really not online teaching. We've been using online platforms. Online teaching is a very different kettle of fish altogether, and requires a lot of design competences, because it's not just you as a lecturer standing like I'm doing now, talking to you. You know, the design is much more complicated than that. So it's a very costly enterprise. Fourth, entrench technology-mediated modalities of teaching and learning, encompassing face-to-face, blended, and online. Fifth, embrace pedagogical changes in terms of curricular design and delivery that involves students as active participants in the learning process rather than passive consumers. Research being done now on the learning habits of the Gen Z, and very soon we're going to be joined by the Alpha generation, shows that their learning is very different even from the millennials who we had a few years ago, and certainly compared to some wazes like me who belong to the baby boomer generation. Seventh, adopt and use educational technologies that support the whole student for student success, going beyond degree completion. Eighth, develop effective policies and interventions to address the digital divide and issues of mental health disorders and learning disability. Mental health is now a very, very serious problem in universities. It was before COVID, it's worse now. Ninth, as learning and student life move seamlessly across digital, physical, and social experiences, universities must safeguard data protection, security, and privacy. 10th, insofar as the market for online programs is transnational, universities must pay special attention to international students who face unique barriers trying to learn in long distances. 11th, they should develop meaningful partnerships with external constituencies and stakeholders, including digital technology and telecommunication companies, to close the glaring employability gap. Just again to give you a figure, there's a long report by one of these consultancy agencies, as well as the World Economic Forum, which show that by 2025, 87 million jobs will become irrelevant, that today are still important. But at the same time, 95 new jobs will emerge that require very high levels of digital literacy. So what are we doing in providing that literacy? 12, universities will increasingly be expected to anchor their research and innovation in the technological infrastructure that supports and enhances the opportunities of the fourth industrial revolution for Africa. As for effective leadership, I also see 12 areas for improvement. The multi-pronged health, economic, financial, and social crisis of COVID-19 have underscored the importance of strategic and smart institutional leadership at all levels. First, it requires ensuring that appointment for institutional heads and governance boards are based on verifiable leadership competences, passion, and understanding of the higher education sector. All too often, their selection reflects misguided political considerations, expectations of donations which are hardly honored in African universities, or preferences for alumni wedded to institutional nostalgia and stasis. Second, university leaders at all levels, from department chairs to deans, vice chancellors to board members, must undergo leadership development training specifically tailored for higher education. Or too often, we get people from outside higher education and impose modalities of leadership from those sectors that work there but may not work in higher education. Third, university leaders must possess and sharpen their financial acuity. In addition to managing complex institutional budgets, they now need to develop ability to manage reductions in staffing, programs, and space. Fourth, cultural competence is more critical than ever. University leaders must go beyond making statements on valuing diversity and inclusion and articulate and exhibit deeper awareness of systemic injustice, inequality, and privilege, and show boundless compassion and commitment for promoting an inclusive institution, for promoting inclusive excellence. Fifth, they must display technological deftness. In an increasingly digitalized academy, it's no longer enough for university leaders to be comfortable using emerging technologies, but to model and promote institutional technological savviness and competence, and develop analytics expertise to promote data-driven decision-making. Sixth, the pandemic has shown that crisis management is essential. Besides preparing for traditional, natural, and security threats, leaders are currently forced to manage physical and mental health crisis, emergency preparedness, and business continuity, and leading in times of uncertainty. Seventh, leaders need an entrepreneurial mindset. More than ever, investors want leaders who are calculated risk takers, innovative entrepreneurs, and effective in promoting the university mission as they create beneficial external partnerships and revenue generation initiatives. Eighth, political savviness is an important asset, as university leaders are increasingly required to work in uncertain and politically polarized times at national, regional, and global levels that challenge them to pursue and promote advocacy and institutional discourse that is calm, informed, and respectful, which we see in many of our institutions is not the case. Ninth, empathy and respect is essential, as mental stress and financial insecurity rise among university stakeholders. Leaders are expected to demonstrate empathy and respect for all their internal constituencies. They must reveal their humanity, even in decision-making. 10th, multi-genre communication skills are indispensable. Further to strong written and verbal communication skills, leaders are now increasingly expected to provide efficient, timely, clear, and persuasive messages and stories to diverse constituencies using multiple platforms, including social media. 11th, possessing high emotional intelligence is a must. Additional to the ability to demonstrate confidence and empathy, leaders are more and more expected to demonstrate self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, and social skills rather than egotism, impulsivity, and proneness to bullying and micromanagement. Finally, agility is necessary. On top of well-established professional knowledge and experience, success increasingly depends on a leader's ability to be flexible in the face of many challenges, have the capacity to learn and assume new and more responsibilities, and show fortitude and flappability and moral compass. Building strong institutional cultures requires adherence to 7 critical values. First is academic freedom, which in most jurisdictions embodies 2 dimensions: the freedom of inquiry for faculty and students, and the procedural and substantive autonomy of institutions. In the first instance, a faculty member should be able to teach or express scholarly views without fear of reprisals. And in the second, an institution has the right to determine for itself on academic grounds how its core business of teaching and learning is conducted. In many African countries and universities, academic freedom in both senses is contested and often breached by pervasive authoritarian interventions and impulses by the state, administration, and governing boards. Second is shared governance, which refers to the participation and demarcation of rights and responsibilities in decision-making between faculty, management, and governing boards. Typically, faculty is expected to exercise authority on academic matters, such as the curriculum, instruction, and degree requirements. As universities have become more complex and demands for accountability increased, democratic organizational processes have been eroded, replaced by what critics call corporatization and managerialism. It is critical to balance the management of the university as a complex organization and the tradition and ethos of collegiality, participation, and distributed power by maintaining what is called in South Africa cooperative governance. Third is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Given their critical role as pathways for social mobility and leadership across all sectors, universities are increasingly expected to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels and for all their constituencies. Inequalities of access, support, and success are deeply entrenched across Africa's and the world's multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, gendered, and class societies that are also marked by other forms of difference and discrimination. By providing opportunities for underrepresented groups and creating and sustaining an inclusive climate through their mission, values, policies, and practices, universities promote inclusive excellence for institutional and national progress. Fourth, civility and collegiality. The academic mobbing or bully culture, as Dala Twale and Barbara DeLuca call it in their book, by that title, has grown. Incivility and intolerance in universities has several manifestations. At a macro level, it reflects the frictions of increasing diversification of university stakeholders, growing external pressures for accountability, and the descent of political discourse into angry populisms. Student and faculty incivility are also fueled by a rising sense of entitlement, consumerist attitudes, emotional immaturity, stress, racism, tribalism, sexism, ageism, xenophobia, social media, and other pervasive social and institutional ills that universities must confront and address to foster healthier institutional climate. Fifth, universities must maintain their role as generative spaces in the rigorous search for truth. The postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-coloniality, and the movement for decolonizing knowledges has vigorously and rightly contested the epistemic architecture and meta-narratives of the Eurocentric academy and its hegemonic knowledges. However, as we pluralize knowledges and universalisms, remake intellectual cultures, and transform our universities, we must resist the relativism of alternative facts, the nihilism of anti-science, the solipsism of self-referentiality, beloved by populist demagogues, many of them products of the world's leading universities, as some critics note, with the neo-fascist Trumpists in the United States who live in a world of alternative facts, even rejecting the fact that Trump lost the elections. Sixth, effective communication is essential for building cohesive communities out of the university's disparate constituencies that have divergent interests, priorities, and preferences. Internally, they are students, faculty, staff, administrators, and governance boards, and externally, prospective students and employers, alumni, parents, government, regulatory agencies, competitors, institutional partners, donors, the media, and general public. This requires developing multiple communication channels, messages, and styles tailored for different audiences to create dialogue and understanding. Good, transparent, and regular internal communication fosters a sense of community, efficiency, and the collective pursuit of institutional mission, vision, and goals. Finally, seventh, embracing social responsibility is vital for investors to eschew institutional navel-gazing for the higher purpose of social impact that can mobilize internal and external stakeholders. Investors are well placed to provide evidence-based knowledge, solutions, and innovations for society. Socially responsible universities need to embed public service in their missions, experiential learning in their curricula, and research that is responsive to pressing local, national, regional, and global problems, as was stressed at a virtual international conference at the University of Pretoria in early February 2021. They need to enhance their social ownership as public goods in tackling social inequities and embrace research sharing with their communities. Financial sustainability, finally, requires pursuing 7 strategies as well. The low financial capacities of African universities is sobering. The FY21, the budget for 2020-2021, for the University of Illinois system, where I spent the longest time in my academic career, and probably the longest since I'm getting old for spending even longer, is this year $6.7 billion. That is probably more than the combined budgets of public universities in several East African countries. In Kenya, the government allocated the equivalent this year of $1.13 billion for all public higher education institutions, down from $1.53 billion in the previous year, of which 1.06 was for salaries and only 70 million for infrastructure development and almost nothing for research. So what should universities do? First, public funding for higher education needs to be raised substantially if African countries are serious about improving the quality of human capital, so essential for integrated and innovative sustainable development. And for them to turn the demographic explosion into a dividend rather than a disaster or a Malthusian nightmare. The barrier of the ghosts of structural adjustment programs is long overdue. African governments need to develop innovative allocation mechanisms to universities encompassing clear funding formulas, performance contracts, and competitive grants open to both public and private universities. The situation we have in Kenya right now is unsustainable. Public funding for higher education per student has not changed since 1989. There is no product, no service, even a boda ride or mboga, samaki or whatever, fish, that is at 1989 prices. And private institutions get about 28,000 shillings per student. The publics get a little over 100,000. That's unsustainable. Third, exercising prudent financial management. As I noted in the framing paper that I shared with you earlier, financial challenges facing higher education institutions require the adoption of more sophisticated and transparent budgeting models to ensure efficient utilization of limited resources. The specter of corruption that undermines the finances of some universities should also be ruthlessly tackled. Fourth, diversifying revenue streams. Universities tend to have 7 major sources of funding, namely government subventions, student tuition, auxiliary services, hostels, things like that, income-generating activities, research grants, philanthropic donations, and loans. African universities could increase income from auxiliary services by providing better accommodation for their students, rather than leaving them captive to shoddy and dangerous neighborhoods, as has become the case on many campuses. Professor Chacha, Nyaigoti Chacha, stated 3 years ago at a conference that our generation, we are basically the same age, going to university was like going to a 5-star hotel. For this current generation of students, it's like going to prison, crowded, unhealthy, dangerous. That is unconscionable. That is irresponsible for university leaders. Undertaking entrepreneurial activities, including consultancies, offering executive programs, and establishing enterprises that leverage their expertise and innovations. Consistently bringing in large research grants. Our universities must do more research. Our faculty must bring more research money. And raising philanthropic donations from Africa's rapidly expanding middle classes and high net worth individuals, whose numbers reached 200,000 in 2017, with a collective wealth of $1.7 trillion. Africa's higher net worth individuals do not give largely to universities. If they give to universities, ironically, they are ready to give to the universities of the global north. Fifth, creating institutional mergers. There is no doubt that Africa needs more universities, but they must be financially sustainable. Many of the public and private universities that have mushroomed in the last 2 decades are simply, as I said earlier, glorified high schools. For economies of scale in the higher education sector, mergers are imperative, even for the fiercely independent and often thinly disguised for-profit private universities. This has to be part of a strategic agenda for diversification and differentiation, accompanied, as I indicated earlier, by horizontal and vertical articulation of higher education institutions at national, regional, and continental levels. There's no point in every university trying to offer graduate degrees when it doesn't have the faculty to supervise them. Sixth, forging robust interinstitutional collaborations is imperative. University consortia will become increasingly necessary to promote quality education, facilitate cost sharing, and bargaining in the procurement of expensive technological infrastructures, instructional materials, talent development, and to facilitate the mobility of students, faculty, credit transfer, and the development of interinstitutional innovative programs and practices. Finally, strengthen external partnerships with other higher education institutions and non-academic sectors and organizations is important. All patterns of asymmetrical internationalization under which Africa was subordinated to Euro-American institutional and epistemological systems must be replaced by strategic inclusion, mutuality, and co-creation of activities and initiatives, and humanizing internationalization by abandoning exploitation of international students who tend to be treated as cash cows. This is one reason why at USIU, we are very fortunate that we are working with the MasterCard Foundation, which believes in the co-creation of activities, of initiatives, which is not necessarily the case with other foundations and other providers of resources. Also important are partnerships with the private sector, which invests in skills and needs to complement government funding in promoting high quality education and reduce the much bemoaned skills gap. A lot of employers complain about the qualifications of students coming from universities, but the question is, what do they do to support those universities to raise quality? Universities have to be discerning in establishing public-private partnerships to ensure they are not exploited, as has happened to some universities, including in this country, in which some universities have been left with tens of millions in debt because of certain very carelessly negotiated deals. Critical players also include African international and intergovernmental agencies that often play second fiddle to their foreign counterparts in funding university activities and formulating policies. In this presentation, I've tried to share ideas on the nature, dynamics, and possible futures of African higher education. Some of the data might be disconcerting, but it is not meant to disempower us, rather to enrage and energize us. I come from the radical tradition of the 1970s and 1980s, honed in Southern Africa's experiences of liberation struggles. That as we strive for better futures, we must combine what we used to call the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. That is, there is need for cold-hearted analysis of conditions as they are, not as you think they are, or as you wish they are, as you dream they are, but as they really are. And at the same time, ironclad conviction of the agency we possess to bring about change. That is why when people talk about this, what I'm going to say in a minute, I'm neither an Afro-pessimist nor an Afro-optimist, but an Afro-realist. Higher education is too important for Africa's future to be held captive to haphazard interventions and superficial reforms. What is needed is fundamental transformation, thanks in part to the very massive disruptions of COVID-19. Studies show the return on investment for education are much higher for society and individuals than any other form of investment. This applies to all levels, including tertiary, not just primary education, as we were told by the misguided missionaries who propagated the neoliberal assault on African universities during the continent's lost decades of the 1980s and 1990s, with the connivance of anti-intellectual and anti-developmental African states and leaders. I believe we can remake the future of African higher education to realize Agenda 2063. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very, very much, Professor Paul Zeleza. I think if there's nobody who speaks so in such an informed perspective of where we are coming from and where we need to go in African higher education as you do, and I'm so, so glad you have written books on that. So for those even who want more discussion, I think get his book on Africa and disruptions in the 21st century. He's also written another book on African universities in the 21st century with Olukoshi, volume 1 and 2. But I just want to say thank you so much for, such the mind-boggling. The statistics are shocking, and I think I do not want to share my excitement about the talk. I would want the rest of the attendants here present, please let me know. And I also want to acknowledge about 7 vice chancellors who are in attendance. So we have Professor Kenoye from Jarvis Christian College. We also have Professor Philip Mayo from the University of East Africa, Baraton University. Professor Thomas Senaji, the East African University, the Deputy Vice Chancellor. We have Professor Kisa Omumo, Scottish Christian University in attendance. Professor Romanas Otieno from Meru University of Science and Technology, Karibu, in attendance. Professor Deogratius Jagani from Mount Kenya University, also in attendance. So all these are the vice chancellors that we are very privileged to have on this webinar. Professor Dina Mwinzi, the KAG, Kenya Assemblies of God, East African University, also the Vice Chancellor, attendance, and also Professor Victoria Wambui Ngume, the Vice Chancellor of Jomo Kenyatta University of Science and Technology, JKU. Karibuni, Vice Chancellors, and all other guests attending. So I would welcome anybody who wants to speak to Professor Zeleza's very, very provocative and informed and comprehensive lecture on higher education in Africa, where we are coming from in the future in this post-COVID world. So perhaps, Prof, I'll read you some of the questions that I can see in the chat as you take a break. It's been a long lecture. So we have Jimmy Adegoke, I can imagine, from Nigeria. And he's saying that as helpful as it is to explore the implications of the post-COVID era for higher education in Africa, we might profit more from examining just how well the higher education sector is currently doing in responding to what is in fact an ongoing COVID pandemic. So he's arguing for a deep postmortem analysis as a sine qua non for understanding how best to plot pathways for system level or transformative change in the post-COVID era. We have James Gomez, who I think all he's asking is for the presentation to be recorded. Yes, we are recording it. There is also someone asking, how in your own understanding can we as African higher education institutions improve capacity for research, innovation, and community engagement? I think you did when you talked about the 4 futures, and one of them was research, but I think that is okay. Again, James Gomez is asking, how can African leadership and the government specifically be encouraged to directly fund research and not leaving R&D with donor support, knowing fully well that the research agenda can be hijacked? I totally agree. I was shocked, Professor Zeleza, when you have given us the statistics about the funding in the University of Illinois in comparison with Kenyan, East African universities. Shocking. So those are the questions from the chat. From the Q&A, we have Raphael Muli Wambua. I think I'll read all of them and then you can maybe in a summary. And he's asking, what options are there in mobilizing resources, support of universities in this era of changing technology? So what options exist for us to mobilize resources that can support universities? I think you also gave some good ideas on that in your last section on financial sustainability. An anonymous attendee is asking, are the restore, evolve, and transform sequential stages that depend on the preceding what was there before? We also have somebody asking, could you give specific anecdotal examples of success stories you could give for post-COVID transformation initiatives that can be studied? And one of our students, Simbarashe Mutadanzi, and Simbarashe, you'll still present your poem at the end, is asking, in previous years, higher education institutions in Africa have been known for the exclusion of sports and arts activities and treating them as extracurricular. So how can higher education be used as a tool to create a sustainable, professional, and socially included sports and arts industry? Perhaps I should let you speak to that, and then we can look at the other 4.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wamai. So the first one, how is African universities doing in terms, and how can it plot forward at the system level? I think this is an ongoing process. There has to be, in my view, at a minimum, serious, sustained, ongoing dialogues between the 3 key players. One is, of course, government. 2 is the private sector. And 3 is the universities themselves. In Kenya, you will remember, some of you, that our chair of the Board of Trustees set up with colleagues LIWA, linking industry with academia. And that was really intended to foster these kinds of dialogues. And we need to do more of that to ensure that we influence policymakers. And that also requires creating think tanks. Think tanks, live in the space between, universities, the public, in terms of course, think tanks do a lot of research, but they learn how to translate research into policy. Your typical academic knows how to write this convoluted paper. That's not meant to be disrespectful. And sometimes use the language that only other people in that field understand. But if you give that paper to a minister of ICT or minister of education or whatever ministry you're talking about, frankly, they have no time to read that stuff. So you need expertise in terms of policy translation. And that is usually think tanks. If you look at the entire African continent, I did a keynote recently for the African Academy of Sciences, looking at think tanks, the interface between universities, the public and the private and so on. The number of think tanks that are devoted to the higher education sector is negligible. In fact, it's almost non-existent. So we need that space of translation, of engagement, and so on. So improving capacity for research, I addressed some of those issues. It's a very multi-pronged agenda. At one level is resources, frankly. It's as simple as that. Are the resources available? Who's providing the resources? What you find in African countries is that typically, and Dr. Njoki Wamai made a reference to this, you find that the resources are usually given by foreign agencies, given by foundations, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you look at, countries where systems of research are very, very seriously developed or taken very seriously, you find that the biggest source of research are 2 sources. And the third one I'll mention, and first is government. The US federal government, for example, gives, tens of billions of dollars for research. Johns Hopkins University alone, every year it gets about $1 billion from the National Institutes of Health. And 40% of that goes into the coffers of the university, 400 million, to do other things. And the second source is business. In fact, in some countries, business is ahead of government as a source of research. So, university business partnerships in terms of research, in which not only do you have these research parks, whereby business and universities are working together, and you get the business people who want to make improvements in their products, in their services, having students who are doing master's, PhD, and faculty who are doing very interesting research in those areas. So they are doing the academic piece, but it's also going to feed into the innovative pipeline in terms of change. So I think the resources, the structures of research that we should build, and commitment to research. I tell my friends, including my fellow vice chancellors and other people in administrative offices, that while of course we're very busy people doing other things on a day-to-day basis, it's important for us to model research behavior. Of course, you can't do it the way you would do if you didn't have those positions. Because what happens is, if you give up doing your own research, 2 things happen. A, you begin to lose appreciation of the importance of research. And 2, you begin to become resentful of people who are producing knowledge, and you don't therefore celebrate them and encourage them and create modalities of continuous support. So commitment is another. The the one about African governments, I already addressed that in terms of lobbying. Examples. There's some really interesting things going on, and that's one thing I always like to appeal to people. Please, let's do research and know about the African landscape, because with all the challenges, some people are doing really very, very creative, innovative things. I can think of several universities in South Africa, University of Pretoria, Nelson Mandela University, Wits, and Cape Town. I mentioned this because with Cape Town and Nelson Mandela, I've been affiliated with UCT since 2006 as an honorary professor. So I follow what happens there. But you also have, Fred Swanepoel, this very visionary young Ghanaian, setting up the African Leadership University. You listen to him talk. I mean, he gave a presentation at Harvard in 2017 at a conference organized by USIU, by the way, and Harvard University on the role of the diaspora in higher education. And I remember when he gave his talk, some of us were absolutely, mesmerized by the vision of how the African University could be transformed. And then at the same time, there were some of us, some of my old colleagues, people of my age, who were absolutely horrified by what he was saying, because he was basically saying the current model of the university is dead, or it will be dead sooner rather than later. I'm not saying that what he said was true, or that interpretation was what Fred was trying to pass along. But the point is, let's do more research across Africa. And this is another area where we are weak as a continent. Apart from South Africa, there are not many centers of higher education research on the continent that are devoted to doing research on higher education as a field. So we understand the trends, the challenges, and so on. Because without that understanding, we can't go very far. There was a very interesting article I read a couple of days ago from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And this is true of most of us as academics. We are very good at analyzing what's happening in society, whether it's politics, the economy, and pass very heavy-handed judgments. But we are very poor at understanding how our own institutions actually function. And we have all sorts of assumptions how these institutions work. So we don't even invest a little bit of our intellectual energy trying to really understand the development, the current positioning, and the future trajectories of these institutions. We assume because we are in the university, we understand. It's like somebody assuming that because they speak a language, they can write. They are a writer in that language. That's a particular skill you develop. In terms of the other questions that are here, what are the other? I think I talked about the different options of mobilizing resources. One that I would like to emphasize that I think as universities and societies, we really need to pay a lot of attention to is really raising resources from two sources: alumni and high net worth individuals. Again, countries, societies differ, traditions differ. But if you look at the countries that have, or universities that have large, fundraising capabilities, say the United States, 70% of the money these universities raise come from alumni. Now, I've talked to alumni in different African countries. The first question they ask, but why should I give? I pay tuition. So it's a mindset issue. And we don't find it problematic to provide resources for primary and secondary education. The Harambee movement in this country, the independent schools movement, which started in the 1920s, is an example of that initiative. Part of the reason is that for higher education, the private part of higher education is recent. So in terms of consumer behavior, the expectation is that the state is looking after it, which of course is no longer true the way it used to be. So if you charge, even in terms of tuition, you find that if you charge tuition that is very different from one university to another, you'll be in trouble. Nobody raises those questions when it comes to primary and secondary. You know that if your kid goes to ISK, Peponi, Breban, they're not going to pay the same tuition as other places. So the very market of higher education and consumer attitudes to higher education is something that we need to think about and really, over time, try to transform that. So that's one. But the second thing is the high net worth individuals. I'll tell you a story. I was in a meeting at Harvard one time a few years ago, and a friend of mine there was telling me, and I won't mention any names, the University of Harvard University has various boards, and the president of Harvard has an advisory board of people from different world regions, and the one that sits for the Africa part of the board, the advisory, they really have no power, has the who's who of Africa billionaires, and of course they're very proud of that, and they give money. And one day, an advisory board for not even the university, but for a center, in a meeting, the director of the center said, we need to raise more money. So this very rich African said, how much do you think you need? And the man said, quite a bit. And the person opened their checkbook and signed a check of $1 million on the spot. And I said to myself, that money would go much, much further in an African country, in an African university. So the behavior of our elites to supporting institutions on the continent, from healthcare to education, is not there. And the reason is very simple. Their children do not come to these schools. They go abroad. So they have no investment, whether these universities collapse or not. Just like before COVID, they didn't care, in terms of the scale of and the nature of healthcare systems, because if they're sick, they'll fly abroad. COVID has done something which I think, in a very sort of ironical way, has forced African elites to begin thinking that building your own institutions, from universities to healthcare systems, is imperative for your own health and for your own children's education. So that may be. Now, the issue about arts and sports, I think that's a very, very good question. I think it's very dangerous for investors to ignore the arts. It's important, obviously, to focus on STEM. For me, I call it STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. If you look at the jobs of the 21st century, ironically, those jobs are the ones that require liberal arts skills. They require things that those of us trained in the liberal arts, we take for granted. That is critical thinking, creativity, communication, interpersonal relationships, understanding phenomena, international literacy, interdisciplinary literacy, information literacy, intercultural literacy, all those things that you really pick out in the humanities and social sciences. If you look at some of the greatest inventions, take Steve Jobs, what made Apple, such a special product? Steve Jobs was not an engineer in the sense that he was thinking through all these things, but he was a visionary, and he believed in the beauty of the product. That is not just a question of its functionality, but it has to look and feel beautiful, the aesthetics. And where do you get that? You get it in the arts. So the arts are extremely important, and they will become even more important because the economies of the 21st century are creative economies. And if you look at all these reports on jobs of the future, a lot of and I won't mention areas because I'm a VC, so I don't want to be misled. Some of our areas of focus over the last 40, 50 years, frankly, they will become irrelevant. and new areas are going to become more and more. The jobs that are disappearing in areas that we have focused a lot on over the last 50 years. So we need to focus on the creative arts, in my view. And it's also an economic imperative. You remember in 2014, when Nigeria's economy was being rebased, part of the rebasing of that economy, which led Nigeria to be ranked as a bigger economy than South Africa, was the impact of the creative industries, the creative economy, Nollywood and others, employing more than 1 million people and bringing in a lot of money. And of course, COVID-19 has taught us that consuming entertainment is important. And we can't continue consuming from other people. We are all hungry to consume our own representations of ourselves. And we need to train. And I'm very happy that at USIU, we set up the School of Communication, Cinematic and Creative Arts in recognition of that. And if you look at very high levels in terms of the interface between creativity and technology, the biggest industry in terms of what I'm going to talk about, film, of course, is a huge industry, but gaming is even bigger than the film industry. So this is not only important for people's sense of self, collective self, in other words, the construction of identities, the invention of nationality and identity, what Anderson, discussed in his book many years ago about the whole question of how societies create collective identities.
Prof, we have, I think, 3 more minutes or 5. So there is somebody's hand who has been up. What's her name? Florence Wakoko. If we could probably unmute her mic so that she could ask from the floor, that would be lovely. And then while you're answering, Florence, there are also other questions in the question and answer.
Sure.
I don't know whether you can see them.
Yes, I can see them. Thank you.
Yeah. After Paula Musuva, I think we had answered the previous ones. And actually, there's a very good question. What should be an individual faculty's goal to thrive in post-COVID? That's from that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there are a number of things. One is COVID has been very, very difficult for all of us. And I think one of the things we simply have to do for ourselves as individuals and as communities is protect our mental health. That's really, really critical. And secondly, I think we have to have an attitude, in my view, of not trying to recreate the past. I'm a historian, so it's almost counterintuitive. The past cannot be recreated. Every crisis, every major event leaves new challenges and new opportunities. So we have to ask ourselves, what are these opportunities at an individual level and at a collective level? And for me, I think as faculty, we really have to take the research agenda seriously in terms of being part of the solution to the continent's problems. So I think we need to redouble our efforts in terms of research. And then the third thing, we also have to, what COVID has demonstrated is that, first of all, it's a very good thing that, not COVID, but what it has demonstrated, that universities and faculty can be very nimble. Universities are supposed to be these very difficult institutions to change. There is the famous statement by President Wilson, who was a racist in Woodrow Wilson. He was president of the US and then also before that president of Princeton. And he made a statement that changing the curriculum in an educational institution is more difficult than moving the graveyard. And of course, by that he meant, and a lot of people mean, that universities are very conservative institutions. They don't move very fast. COVID-19 has shown that's not true. we pivoted as universities very quickly, everything else being equal in terms of lack of resources and so on and so forth. So one of the things which I think we have learned is that, teaching and learning, we can change it and make it more effective. Last semester, I taught a course, my course in the International Relations department. And for me, what I found, of course, there were challenges, Wi-Fi connectivity, and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the actual experience in the class, there was more interaction because we could break the students into groups, more engagement. The ones who are shy in face-to-face were participating. So the question is, how do we use the COVID-19 experience to accelerate pedagogical changes, which I talked about in the context of the digitalization of the university? So those are some of the few areas, of course, there are a lot more. Please describe from Dr. Musuba, yes, of an African university in 2030. That's a good one. I want it to be a globally competitive institution that is not only providing the best education for African students, but the best education for any student who wants to study. The data on internationalization is very poor for Africa. Only 4.24% of the more than the various millions, dozens of millions of students internationally. Only about 4.24%, 4.26% come to Africa or move from their countries. That includes students, of course, moving within Africa. Africa exports 10.3% of international students. And part of the reason is what I said earlier. Our rich people, their kids go abroad, but also our universities are not that attractive. So I want our universities to be very competitive by 2030 to retain some of their best, to attract some of the best in the world, to be very productive, to be the centers that are inventing things that transform our economies, transform world economies, that produce, ways of doing business. In other words, they manage the institutions that other people come to borrow instead of us always borrowing. In other words, vibrant, resilient, sustainable, productive institutions.
There's another about COVID-19. I think it's the same, of universities coming together and studying foreign vaccines to ascertain their efficacy on African populations. Wow. And a critique, someone offering a critique about John Beatty. I hope you've read that, because he says African time is only Zamani, in the past and now. So really, do we have a future?
Yeah, we do. Obviously, concepts of time, when we talk about African time, it's not African time. It's peasant time. Yeah. Peasants have a different rhythm, different notion of time. There is a book which, absolutely brilliant, by a friend of mine. She's African American. She wrote this book called The Moon is Dead, Give Us Our Money. And it was about the transition from peasant time to industrial time in South Africa, with the miners and so on. And for them, they would look at the moon and say, if the moon is dead, it means it's the end of the month, give us money. And she was exploring these very complicated concepts of time. And the tendency is we tend to assume that's African time. Peasant societies, whether in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, peasant societies are a very different rhythm of time. The issue is, to what extent are we behaving as people in an industrial society? All of us have various gadgets. The phone tells your time. Your watch tells your time. But you want to cling to this thing called African time. In other words, you're trying to cling to peasant time. You're not a peasant, for goodness sake. And when it says 3 o'clock, be there at 3 o'clock. You're part of an industrial society. So now, on a larger question, the notion that we only have Zamani, that we only have the past, that's not exactly true. Because again, we have to be very careful with Africa. Africa is a very complicated continent. with very different societies, different histories, and even levels of development. So when I hear somebody say this is African, I always question where in Africa, for which community, for which time period. And in Africa, in history, for example, we historians don't use the term traditional because we find it's meaningless. It doesn't tell you anything. What is traditional for your grandparent was not traditional for their great-great-parents. Things change. We tend to freeze time. And it becomes a comfortable way of rationalizing certain behaviors.
True that. I will welcome Florence Wakoko to ask your question.
Yeah, very quickly, our universities and Mungai preparing graduates for a future Africa? The answer is no. We are not doing, I think, a good job in that. A lot of our curricula, and I'm not talking about any particular university, of course there are exceptions. A lot of our curricula is antediluvian. We tend to be very resistant to curricular changes. And that's, many of us as faculty, I include myself, we need to be a lot more open to change and make sure that I tell, when I give public talks to students here at USIU and so on, I always say that, we are not training these students for the last 40 years of our lives. I was in college myself. I went to university in 1972. So we are training them for the next 40 years of their lives. So let's not, spend time on things that we think were important for us. What are those things important for them? And essentially, those are the fundamentals of liberal learning and education and so on, what I talked about earlier. So, and there is, of course, a big debate, to what extent do universities prepare students for the job market? You have to be very careful balancing between vocationalization of the university and the university's traditions of enduring intellectual inquiry and so on. But it's a balance we always have to ask ourselves. And that means reading where we are going. You cannot treat this Gen Z generation, as I said, the way we even treated millennials or Gen X, So let's be attentive to who is coming to our campuses and be willing to be flexible, willing to change. What can be done to protect the young innovators' intellectual property? Brilliant question, thank you. I think universities have to, simply develop intellectual property policies. USIU is one of the few that has a very comprehensive intellectual property policy. Because what happens typically is that you find a young person who has got this brilliant idea, is talking to somebody in industry, and they say, oh yeah, we'll give you a job. And then, of course, they steal your idea, and before you know it, it's bringing tens of millions of shillings and so on, and you're just getting a salary. So we need to ensure that we have policies on that, but two, we need to raise awareness about what intellectual property means. Let me just mention something about intellectual property, which sometimes people get motivated because they think it brings money. Of course it does, but it's not as much as people assume. Harvard, for example, makes less than 1% of its income from intellectual property. So this notion that intellectual property will bring you tens of millions, you have to be very careful. It's important in and of itself to protect your young people, obviously.
We are now going to welcome our poet, who is a student of USIU from Zimbabwe. That's one of the very good things about USIU being a Pan-African university, and we have more than 70 nationalities. So Florence, you could quickly ask your question and then welcome Simbarashe from Zimbabwe, our student, to present his poem on Africa Day.
Okay, thank you. Should I start? Can you hear me?
Sorry.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay. Simbarashe is our student Maybe Simbarashe, you can introduce yourself quickly as you now present your poem on it was to celebrate Africa Day and also to celebrate the Vice Chancellor for a great lecture and presentation. I think even just before Simbarashe presents, if you could all unmute yourselves and we clap and give him a digital ovation for that matter, for a great presentation, very insightful, and we are very privileged to have listened to that. For me, the statistics are mind-boggling. We have to do something, and I think we could not have wished for a better person to present this webinar for Africa Day and also as a public lecture to celebrate the university, not just the university in Africa, but also the university around the world and its resilience or lack of it for some of them in these very difficult times of COVID-19. So can we maybe unmute and clap, Professor? This is our thank you for your time and for your great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So now I welcome Simbarashe to present his poem on Africa Day, and also to speak. That also is meant to celebrate and honor our presenter today, who is our very own Vice Chancellor. Simbarashe, please, the floor is yours. The virtual floor.
Thank you. My name is Barasham Tandazi. I'm an accounting major. I'm here representing the Spoken Arts and Debate Society. And I would want to say happy belated birthday to VC. So my poem is titled Africa We Want, after the Africa Agenda 2063. I hope you enjoyed. Monetize and exploit my people once. Shame on you. Fool me twice. Shame on me, because I couldn't fully capitalize my capability to learn. History is written down for a purpose, and thrice would be an utter disgrace. I'll be damned if I tell you that I don't see the same course unfolding and piercing through my benighted vanguard. Their mindset is still wired to see colonial influence in every conscious. They are lily livered to change. They claim every opposition don't know the struggle and the youths are too westernized, while they themselves are busy signing deals that infest our continent with Western content, devising policies that hinder our people's success. It's been years since we took back our land, but we are not yet free. If we were as independent as we ululate and celebrate every year, we wouldn't be crying to our oppressor to waive sanctions. We wouldn't be trying to tickle pink everyone in the name of diplomacy. We wouldn't be losing $10 for every dollar we get in the name of foreign aid. Certainly, we wouldn't be relying on foreign aid. But what can my people rely on when our leaders are looting from the same people they claim to have liberated, when the same people trusted to usher Africa into a prosperous, democratic Africa don't know the sound of the people's voice anymore? One man, one vote, I reminisce. My people don't vote because they know the policies. They vote for what there was and is their normal. My youth don't know what the ballot looks like, but my elders are too ignorant to understand that change is the only language they pay attention to, not propaganda. Africa is a healing giant, given strength by its will to be independent from the iron shackles of imperialistic scavengers who thought that just because they had the means, they could come and exploit us all they want. Our wounds do not emanate from the bullets and artillery we took in, the blood and tears we shed, but from civilization, a gift forged for the greater good, transformed into an apex colonial tool, white man's burden, they called it. So let us do them a favor and free ourselves. We are never free until we learn to embrace our cultural heritage while we acknowledge the flaws that are in it and address them for the betterment of African societies. We are never free until we emancipate ourselves from the horrors of yesteryear. We are Africa because we choose to embrace the struggle that we are born of. the history we are not shy of, the pigmentation we are proud of, the culture that we are in the Africa that we want. We are Africa, and in us, Africa lives on. Happy Africa Day. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much. Simbarashe Mutandadazi. Thank you so much, and happy birthday, Professor Zeleza. So this is also our little gift to say happy birthday. As a Pan-Africanist and somebody I know who loves this continent, it's the least we could do.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I now want to welcome Dr. Queen Juma, who will now give a vote of thanks to the presenters and to the presenter, our presenter who is Professor Zeleza, and everybody else, and some of the people who attended. I can see Dr. Chandaria was still, I think is still there, and the many vice chancellors, and of course the many friends of USIU that are gathered here today. So we thank you. But Karibu, Dr. Queen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Njoki Omai. That was good moderation. Mine will be very brief because of time. I want to pass my vote of thanks and to the keynote speaker this evening, Professor Paul Zeleza, Vice Chancellor, USIU-Africa, the honorable members of the USIU-Africa Management Board, University Council members present, the acting DVCAA, the deans of school, USIU-Africa faculty, staff, and students, our most valued invited guests present. Ladies and gentlemen, hamjambo, good morning and good evening. Considering the varied time zones that you are in and you are calling from, we truly appreciate your presence. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose the vote of thanks on this very special webinar occasion. It is once said that feeling gratitude and not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it out. So on behalf of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the entire USIU-Africa fraternity and the organizers of this event, I want to say a big thank you to Professor Zeleza for his continued passion, efforts, and research on higher education in Africa, especially in the thinking around university education in the post-COVID world in Africa. Prof, we are all glad that you are able to honor this date. As one guest once observed in the chat, Prof. Zeleza's depth in research and presentation has always been very informative, impressive, timely, and well articulated. As Dr. Njoki just said a few minutes ago, we couldn't have had a better keynote speaker than yourself, our VC. We thank you. I would like to also truly thank the USIU-Africa Chancellor, Dr. Manu Chandaria, who is present and in the panel this evening. We truly appreciate, Daktari, your presence, and we are glad that you are able to join us. I must also mention our deep sense of appreciation to all the vice chancellors that have already been recognized earlier and their representatives who managed to join us in this webinar. Thank you, and we are truly grateful that you created time to be with us. I may like also to express my sincere thanks to the DVC USIU, Professor Mulinge, in a very special way for creating time and giving us the good introduction towards the keynote speaker, and also to all the deans of schools available and present here, the faculty and also the student, especially Simba Aratse, who composed a special poem in honor of our VC and on his belated birthday, which was yesterday. I'm also grateful to the larger university, USIU community, friends and partners represented in this forum. I do wish to express my gratitude as I acknowledge the efforts of the Dean of School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Martin Njoroge, for organizing and hosting this special webinar event in our school. Thank you so much for that effort. Finally, I take this opportunity to place on record my hearty thanks to the VC's Webinars Committee, which I chaired, and it comprised of myself, Department of Languages and Literature, Ms. Brenda Odhiambo, USIU Marketing, Mr. Ernest Andugo, ICT, Dr. Njoki Wamai, Department of International Relations, Ms. Lynette Nzioki, Dean's Office, Dr. Mshemi Joyce, Department of Criminal Justice, Dr. Peterson Mwangi, Department of Psychology, Ms. Salome Asena Niera, for putting all this together. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I want to state that we are all most grateful to all the attendees, contributors on the chat, speakers, the panel that managed to address the questions, the panelists, and the session moderator, Dr. Njoki Wamai. I thank you for being with us this evening. It's been a great pleasure and evening well spent. Thank you very much. On behalf of the organizing committee and my co-moderator, Dr. Njoki Wamai, I'm Dr. Queen Juma. I wish you a very restful evening, a fruitful day to the rest of us on different time zones. Kwaherini, thank you very much. It was our pleasure hosting you at the School of Humanities. Thank you.